There are moments in your life that act as a fulcrum, points upon which the entire weight of your history and the vast, unknown expanse of your future pivot. They rarely announce themselves. There is no fanfare, no dramatic shift in the lighting of the room, no orchestral swell. They arrive disguised as something ordinary, something quiet. For me, that moment was the specific, measured weight of another person's heartbeat against my own. It was the soft, rhythmic exhalation of breath against the fabric of my t-shirt, a sound so profoundly intimate it felt like a secret I was not meant to keep, but one that was being entrusted to me anyway. It was the weight of Leo, my best friend of 15 years, asleep on my chest, his arm draped across my torso with the casual ownership of someone who has forgotten where they end and another person begins. He was a fallen statue in the dim glow of my living room, beautiful and broken and utterly still. The city outside was a distant, humming thing, a creature that had finally curled in on itself for the night, leaving us in this small, quiet bubble of borrowed time. The only light came from a single street lamp filtering through the thin curtains, painting a pale, rectangular ghost on the hardwood floor and catching the edges of his dark hair, turning them to threads of silver. I had been a photographer for most of my adult life, a professional observer, and my mind instinctively began to frame the scene. The chiaroscuro of it all, the deep shadows pooling in the hollow of his cheek, the gentle curve of his spine, the way his hand was curled loosely near my heart. It was a perfect composition of trust and exhaustion. But for the first time in a long time, the artist in me was silenced by the man who was simply trying to remember how to breathe without his own lungs seizing in panic. My own breathing was a tightly controlled exercise, a shallow, careful process of taking in just enough air to survive the moment without disturbing the one that was unfolding on top of me. Every single point of contact between us was a universe of sensation I was meticulously cataloging. The solid, reassuring pressure of his head tucked into the space between my shoulder and my neck. The faint, clean scent of his shampoo mixed with the tired, human smell of a long and difficult day. The almost imperceptible twitch of his fingers against my side as he drifted deeper into sleep, chasing some dream I would never be privy to. I was terrified. It was a quiet, cold terror that lived not in my stomach but in my veins, a slow-moving current of ice. I was terrified of him waking up and realizing the configuration we were in, of seeing a flicker of regret or awkwardness in his eyes that would shatter this fragile truce we had stumbled into. But beneath the terror, humming like a subterranean river, was a feeling so profound, so achingly tender, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of being lost. It was the feeling I had been systematically burying for over a decade, a feeling I had partitioned off into a locked room in the architecture of my own heart. And here it was, lying on my chest, breathing my air, entirely unaware of the sheer, catastrophic power it held over me. This stillness, this quiet tableau on my worn-out gray couch, was not a beginning. It felt like one, but it was really the culmination of a slow, seismic shift that had begun 3 months prior. It began, as so many life-altering events do, with a knock on my door late on a Tuesday night. It wasn't Leo's usual knock, a quick, confident rhythm that always sounded like he was already halfway through the door and on to the next thought. This was a hesitant, broken sound, a sound that asked permission. I opened the door to find him standing there, drenched from a sudden downpour that had broken over the city, his shoulders slumped and his face a pale, stark mask of disbelief. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, the usual easy confidence that he wore like a second skin stripped away, leaving something raw and uncertain in its place. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, dripping onto my welcome mat, his gaze fixed on some point just past my shoulder, as if he was looking for an escape route he knew did not exist. "She's gone," he finally said, and the words were not spoken so much as they were released, 2 small stones dropping into a deep, silent well. Clara, his girlfriend of 6 years. The woman I had watched him fall in love with, the woman I had photographed at birthday parties and holiday gatherings, always with a professional and emotional distance I had perfected over the years. I had learned to see her through my lens as a collection of shapes and light, a component in a composition, rather than the centerpiece of the life of the person I loved most in the world. It was a necessary act of self-preservation. Now, the composition was shattered. I stepped aside without a word, and he walked past me into the apartment, leaving a trail of rainwater on the floor like a wounded animal marking its path. He sank onto the couch, the very same couch where he would later find a different kind of solace, and buried his face in his hands. The sound he made then was a ragged, hollow thing, the sound of a structure collapsing from the inside out. For the next few weeks, my apartment became his sanctuary. He was a software consultant who worked from home even before it was commonplace, his life a carefully constructed ecosystem of code, client calls, and a gym. But his own apartment, the one he had shared with Clara, had become a ghost ship, haunted by the memories of a future that had been abruptly canceled. So he came to mine. At first, it was under the pretext of needing a change of scenery to work, or wanting to watch a game, or just not wanting to eat takeout alone. I understood the unspoken truth. He just couldn't bear the silence of his own space. I didn't push. I didn't pry. I just made coffee, ordered food, and existed as a quiet, stable presence in the wreckage of his life. I became a lighthouse keeper, my small, calm apartment a steady beam in his storm-tossed sea. He would sit on one end of the couch, his laptop glowing in the dim light, and I would sit on the other, editing photos, the soft click of my mouse a counterpoint to the furious clatter of his keyboard. We existed in a comfortable, parallel silence, a silence we had cultivated over 15 years of friendship. But now, that silence was freighted with a new weight, filled with all the things he couldn't say and all the things I was terrified to feel. The shift was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. It began with exhaustion. One night, deep into a project, he closed his laptop with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire world and just stayed. He didn't make a move to go home. He just leaned his head back against the cushions and closed his eyes. An hour later, I looked over and he was asleep, his head lolling at an uncomfortable angle. My heart did a painful, complicated lurch. I watched him for a long time, the tension in his jaw still present even in sleep, the faint lines of stress etched around his eyes. I felt a fierce, protective urge wash over me, a desire to smooth those lines away, to somehow absorb his pain into myself. I quietly retrieved a blanket from the hall closet and draped it over him, my fingers brushing his shoulder for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of forbidden energy. He didn't stir. I retreated to my side of the couch, my own body thrumming with a dangerous, hopeful current, and pretended to work until the sun began to bleed into the eastern sky. This became the first step in our new, unspoken ritual. The late nights of work, the feigned nonchalance, the inevitable slide into sleep on my couch. It was a pattern of plausible deniability. He was tired. He was stressed. It was easier than going back to his empty apartment. Every reason was logical, every explanation sound, and every single one was a lie we had tacitly agreed to believe. Because the truth was far more complicated, a tangled knot of grief, loneliness, and a comfort that was beginning to stray from the clearly demarcated lines of our friendship. The geography of the couch began to change. The 3 feet of neutral territory between us slowly eroded, millimeter by millimeter, night by night. It was a tectonic shift, so slow you could only recognize it by looking back at where you started. One night, he fell asleep with his head on the armrest, his feet stretching out and brushing against my thigh. I froze, every nerve ending in my legs suddenly alive and screaming. He shifted in his sleep, his foot pressing more firmly against me, and I felt a wave of heat spread through my entire body. I didn't move. I sat there for hours, a living statue, until my own legs went numb, terrified that the slightest movement would break the spell. The next stage of the evolution was the pillow. He started a particularly grueling project, pulling all-nighters fueled by coffee and sheer willpower. One night, bleary-eyed and incoherent, he mumbled something about his neck being stiff, and, before I could process it, He had shifted, laid his head in my lap, and was asleep in under a minute. My entire world narrowed to that single point of contact. The weight of his head on my thighs. The feel of his hair, soft and thick, against my jeans. I could feel the faint warmth of him through the denim. I wanted to run my fingers through his hair, a gesture I had seen Clara do 1,000 times with an easy, unthinking intimacy that had always felt like a physical blow to me. My own hands were clenched into fists at my sides, my knuckles white. I was a cartographer mapping a dangerous, new land, a territory of touch that had no name. I was an archaeologist who had unearthed something fragile and precious and was terrified that the very air might turn it to dust. This was a place of profound comfort and exquisite torture, and I found myself unable and unwilling to leave. The ritual solidified, became our new normal. 3 or 4 nights a week, he would end up asleep on my couch, and more often than not, in some configuration that involved us touching. It became a silent negotiation. He would lean his head against my shoulder while we watched a movie, a casual, friendly gesture that felt anything but casual to me. His hand would come to rest on the cushion between us, his pinky finger brushing against mine, a tiny spark in the vast darkness. Each new encroachment was a test, a question he was asking without words. And my stillness, my acceptance, was the answer. I never initiated. I was the quiet observer, the constant, waiting shore against which his restless waves could crash. I was terrified of misreading the signs, of imposing my own desperate hope onto his grief-strafed actions. So I waited. I let him set the pace. I let him define the boundaries, even as he systematically erased them one by one. I existed in a state of suspended animation, holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the morning he would wake up, truly see what was happening, and pull away in horror. But he never did. If anything, he leaned in further. The final stage of our couch ritual began on a cold November night. A storm was raging outside, the wind howling and rattling the window panes. We had abandoned any pretense of working and were huddled under a shared blanket, watching some mindless action movie. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into a thick, velvety darkness broken only by the frantic blue and white flashes of lightning outside. Leo flinched with a particularly loud clap of thunder. I felt it more than I saw it, a tremor that ran through his entire body. He had always hated thunderstorms, a fact I knew from our college days when he'd show up at my dorm room with some flimsy excuse, seeking refuge from the noise. In the ensuing silence, broken only by the sound of the rain lashing against the glass, he shifted. He turned towards me, untangling himself from the blanket. And then, with a quiet sigh, he simply settled against me, his head finding its now familiar place on my chest, his arm wrapping around my waist, pulling the blanket securely around us both. This was different. This was not the slow, unconscious drift of sleep. This was a conscious choice. He was awake. I could feel the steady, deliberate thump of his heart against my ribs. My own heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. The silence in the room was deafening, filled with the immensity of the unspoken. I could feel his breath on my neck, warm and even. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but my throat was closed, my tongue a useless weight in my mouth. So I did the only thing I could. I slowly, tentatively, raised my own arm and rested it across his shoulders, my hand coming to rest on his upper arm. His muscles tensed for a barest fraction of a second, and then relaxed, melting into my hold. He sighed again, a sound of deep, bone-weary contentment, and snuggled closer, fitting himself against me as if he were a missing piece of a puzzle I never knew I was trying to solve. And that is how he stayed. We didn't speak. We just lay there in the dark, listening to the storm rage outside. Two people holding on to each other as if we were the only solid things left in a dissolving world. It was in that moment, with the weight of him anchored to me, that I understood the hook had been set. This was no longer just about comfort. This was something else, something terrifying and beautiful, and I had no idea where it was going to lead. The crossing happened 2 weeks later. The ritual had become so ingrained in the fabric of our lives that it no longer felt strange, at least not on the surface. Beneath, for me, it was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety and yearning. He was closer than ever, yet the emotional distance felt like a chasm. We were living in a carefully constructed diorama of intimacy, beautiful to look at, but fragile and unreal. That night, he was particularly quiet. The shadows under his eyes were deeper than usual, and he'd been staring at his phone with a grim set to his jaw before tossing it aside in disgust. I assumed it was something to do with Clara, some logistical remnant of their breakup that had resurfaced to torment him. He didn't offer any information, and I didn't ask. Instead, we fell into our usual pattern. A movie we weren't really watching, the low murmur of the television filling the space between us. He was leaning against me, his head on my shoulder, our legs tangled together under the blanket. For a long time, the only sounds were the scripted dialogue from the screen and the soft sound of our breathing. Then he shifted. He pushed himself up slightly, turning to face me. The movement was so unexpected it broke the comfortable spell of the evening. The dim light from the television cast his face in shades of blue and gray, making his expression unreadable. His eyes, though, were luminous, and they were fixed on mine with an intensity that made the air feel thin and hard to breathe. He was so close I could see the faint flecks of gold in the brown of his irises. My heart started a frantic, panic drumming against my ribs. This is it, I thought. This is the moment he realizes. The moment he pulls away for good. I braced myself for the impact, for the awkward apology, for the end of this strange, beautiful dream. He didn't pull away. He raised a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment in the space between us before they came to rest gently on my cheek. His thumb stroked softly over my skin, a touch so feather-light, it was almost imperceptible. It was the most deliberate, most terrifyingly intentional gesture he had ever made towards me. The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. I could feel the slight tremor in his hand, or maybe it was me who was trembling. "Julian," he whispered, his voice rough, barely audible over the movie. I couldn't find my own voice to respond. I could only look at him, my entire being consumed by the question in his eyes. "Would it be okay?" he asked, his voice cracking on the last word. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was offering me a choice, handing me the key to a door I had been staring at for 15 years, a door I never, ever believed would be open to me. All the fear, all the anxiety, all the carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart crumbled in that instant, washed away by a sudden, overwhelming wave of gratitude and a hope so fierce it hurt. I didn't trust my voice, so I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to turn away, to stop him. I didn't. I met him halfway. The first touch of his lips against mine was not passionate or demanding. It was soft, hesitant, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It tasted of salt and uncertainty and a deep, unspoken relief. It was the quietest, most earth-shattering moment of my entire life. To understand the magnitude of that kiss, you have to understand the 15 years that preceded it. You have to go back to a crowded, stuffy university auditorium that smelled of floor polish and nervous sweat. I was 19, an impossibly skinny kid with a camera bag that seemed to weigh more than I did, trying my best to become invisible in the back row of freshman orientation. I was a quiet observer by nature, a documentarian of life rather than a participant, and I was already overwhelmed by the sheer, noisy volume of it all. And then he sat down next to me. Leo. He was the complete opposite of me in every conceivable way. He was all bright, easy energy, with a wide, genuine smile and a confidence that seemed to radiate from him like heat. He was wearing a faded athletic department t-shirt and had the relaxed, powerful build of a swimmer. He turned to me, stuck out a hand, and said, "Leo, engineering. God, is it hot in here, or is it just the crushing weight of our impending student debt?" His humor was disarming, his friendliness a force of nature. I was so taken aback by being spoken to directly that I just stared at his outstretched hand for a beat too long before shaking it, my own hand feeling small and clammy in his warm, dry grip. "Julian," I managed. "Photography," he grinned. "A man of few words and many pictures. I like it." And just like that, an invisible thread was spun between us. We spent the rest of that grueling day together, him cracking jokes about the dean's unfortunate comb-over, me occasionally offering a dry, mumbled observation that would make him laugh, a loud, wonderful sound that made people turn and look. By the end of the day, he had my number and had already made plans for us to investigate the structural integrity of the local pizza joints. It was the most effortless, most unlikely friendship I had ever known. We were an odd pairing, the outgoing athlete and the introverted artist, but it worked. He drew me out of my shell, and I think, provided him with a quiet space to land. My dorm room became his refuge from the boisterous energy of his teammates, a place where he could complain about his thermodynamics professor or just be silent without feeling the pressure to perform. I became the custodian of his anxieties, and he became the champion of my quiet ambitions. He was the first person to see my photographs and tell me, with absolute certainty, that I was going to be brilliant. He came to my first student exhibition, bringing half the swim team with him, and stood proudly beside a black and white portrait I had taken of him, telling everyone who would listen that his genius friend had made him look at least 10% less goofy. My affection for him, in those early days, was a simple, uncomplicated thing. It was the warm, steady glow of a profound friendship. I loved him for his kindness, for his unwavering loyalty, for the way he saw something in me that I couldn't yet see in myself. The change, for me, happened so gradually I didn't recognize it for what it was until it was already a permanent fixture in my emotional landscape. It was a slow-developing photograph, the image emerging bit by bit in the chemical bath of late-night study sessions, shared meals, and easy, comfortable silences. It was the way my heart would beat a little faster when he'd throw an arm around my shoulders after a big win. It was the pang of something sharp and unfamiliar I felt when he would talk about a girl he'd met at a party. I labeled it jealousy, the possessiveness of a close friend, and pushed it down. But it kept resurfacing, stronger each time. The moment of undeniable clarity came in our junior year. He got a bad case of the flu, the kind that completely levels a person. He was too weak to even get out of bed in his shared dorm room, and his roommate was less than sympathetic. I spent 3 days in his room, bringing him soup and water, changing the cool cloth on his forehead, and listening to him mumble deliriously. On the third night, his fever broke. I was dozing in the uncomfortable chair by his bed when I felt a hand on my arm. I opened my eyes to see him looking at me, his own eyes clear for the first time in days. "Jules," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "Thanks. You're the best." He squeezed my arm, his grip weak but firm, and then fell back into a deep, healing sleep. And I sat there in the dark, my arm tingling where he had touched me, and the truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was in love with him, utterly, hopelessly, and irrevocably. It was a terrifying realization. Our friendship was the most important relationship in my life, a foundational pillar in my world. To confess my feelings felt like taking a sledgehammer to that pillar. The risk of losing him, of making him uncomfortable, of shattering the easy intimacy we shared, was too great. So I made a choice. I would be the quiet observer of his life. I would build a fortress around my heart, and I would be the best friend he could ever ask for. I became an expert in compartmentalization. I learned to smile and offer advice when he talked about his dates. I learned to quell the ache in my chest when I saw him kiss someone goodnight. I poured all of my unspoken feelings into my work. He became my unwitting muse. I have hundreds of photographs of him from that time. Leo laughing, a candid shot from across the dining hall. Leo concentrating, his brow furrowed as he studied for an exam. Leo staring out a window, lost in thought, the afternoon light catching the line of his jaw. He never knew that these were not just photographs. They were love letters I could never send. After college, our lives diverged and then reconverged. I struggled for a few years, working odd jobs to support my photography, while he landed a coveted job at a top engineering firm straight out of school. But our friendship remained the constant. We got an apartment together for a while, a chaotic, wonderful time filled with cheap beer, bad cooking, and endless conversation. It was both the happiest and most difficult period of my life. Living with him, seeing him every day, was a constant, low-level torture. I saw him in his most vulnerable moments, fresh from the shower with a towel slung low on his hips, asleep on the couch with a book on his chest. My fortress had to be rebuilt daily, its walls reinforced with every casual touch, every shared laugh. And then came Clara. He met her at a work function. She was smart, funny, and beautiful, and she adored him. I knew from the first time he talked about her that this was different. This was serious. And as their relationship deepened, I knew my time as his roommate, as the central figure in his personal life, was coming to an end. I did what a good friend does. I was supportive. I had them over for dinner. I listened to him talk about their future. And when they decided to move in together, I helped them pack. The day they left, after the last box was loaded, Leo pulled me into a fierce hug. "This isn't changing anything, you know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my brother, Jules." Always, I hugged him back, my own throat tight, and said, I know it was the most profound lie I had ever told, because I knew everything was changing. I was being relegated to a different, more distant orbit in his universe, and a part of me felt like it was dying. But I smiled, and I waved as they drove away. And then I went back into my suddenly vast and silent apartment and allowed myself to grieve for a future I had never truly had a right to want. For 6 years, I maintained my role. I was the steadfast, reliable friend. I was Uncle Julian to their dog. I was the designated photographer at their parties. I watched them build a life together, and I buried my own heart so deep I sometimes convinced myself it had stopped beating altogether. And then came the knock on the door, the rain, and the two small words that changed everything. "She's gone." The aftermath of the kiss was not the gentle, sunlit dawn I had foolishly allowed myself to imagine. It was a thick, disorienting fog. The moment itself had been perfect, a quiet, breathtaking revelation. But when we finally broke apart, the air was immediately charged with a new, volatile energy. The comfortable silence we had always shared was gone, replaced by something heavy and uncertain. Leo wouldn't look at me. He pulled back, running a hand through his hair, his face a mask of confusion. I should go," he stammered, not a question but a panicked declaration. He was off the couch and halfway to the door before I could even form a coherent thought. He grabbed his jacket, fumbled with his keys, and then he was gone, the click of the door closing behind him echoing in the sudden, crushing silence of the room. He left behind the scent of his skin, the ghost of his warmth on the couch cushions, and a gaping, question-shaped hole in the center of my chest. The next few days were a special kind of hell. It was a silence more profound and more painful than any we had ever experienced. My texts went unanswered, my calls went straight to voicemail. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth, or worse, as if he was actively, deliberately avoiding me. The hope that had bloomed so fiercely in my chest withered and died, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting every microsecond of it. Had I imagined the tenderness? Had I misinterpreted the vulnerability in his question? My mind, my greatest tool as an observer, became my torturer, presenting me with an endless slideshow of my own foolishness. He was grieving. He was lonely. He was confused. I was a port in a storm, a convenient, safe harbor. And in a moment of weakness, he had done something he now regretted, something that had horrified him. I had not been a potential future. I had been a temporary comfort, a placeholder for a warmth he was missing, and now the reality of what he had done had sent him running. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting knife in my gut. I had allowed myself to hope, and the universe was now punishing me for my audacity. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The uncertainty was eating me alive. I would rather have the brutal, definitive truth than this slow death by 1,000 imagined scenarios. I needed to know where I stood, even if that place was back outside the fortress, the gates locked for good. I drove to his apartment. It was the first time I had been there since he and Clara had lived there together. Standing in the hallway outside his door felt like a transgression. I could hear the faint sound of a television inside. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I raised my hand to knock, and my own hesitation shamed me. This was Leo. Whatever was happening, we had 15 years of history that demanded more than this ghosting, this cowardly retreat into silence. I knocked, the sound loud and final in the quiet hallway. The silence inside stretched on. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer, that he would just wait for me to give up and go away. Then, I heard the sound of footsteps, the click of the lock. The door opened a few inches, and he was standing there. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same sweatshirt he'd had on for days. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were shadowed and haunted. He looked cornered, a man trapped in a house that was on fire. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, his expression a miserable cocktail of guilt and fear. "Leo," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need to talk." He flinched at the words, but he nodded slowly and opened the door wider. I stepped inside. The apartment was a disaster. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. Clothes were strewn over chairs. It was the physical manifestation of his internal chaos. He didn't invite me to sit. He just stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. The chasm between us felt miles wide. I decided to walk right into it. "What was that?" I asked, keeping my voice level calm. "The other night." "What was it, Leo?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on a crack in the ceiling. "I don't know," he mumbled. "It was a weird moment. I was tired. We'd been drinking that wine. It was a mistake." Each word was a physical blow. A mistake. The most honest, most vulnerable moment of my life, reduced to a drunken error. A cold, hard anger began to burn through the hurt. It was an anger born not of pride, but of a deep, profound sense of betrayal. Not because he didn't reciprocate my feelings, but because he was trying to invalidate the moment itself, to erase its significance, to pretend it meant nothing. He was treating me like a stranger, not the person who had held him while he slept for the last 3 months. "A mistake," I said, and this time my voice was not so calm. "Don't do that. Don't you dare diminish what happened. You asked me, Leo. You looked me in the eye, and you asked me if it was okay. Was that a mistake? Was the last 3 months of you sleeping in my arms a mistake? Was it all just some weird moment?" He winced, the truth of my words hitting him. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were swimming with a misery that was so profound it almost extinguished my anger. "I don't know what it was, Jules," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so messed up right now. My whole life just fell apart. And you were there. You're always there. You're so solid and safe, so that's what I am." I asked, the hurt returning with a vengeance. "I'm a safety blanket? Something you use to feel better until you figure your life out, and then you just toss me aside and pretend it never happened?" "No," he said, the word exploding out of him. "God, no. That's not what you are. It's not like that." He finally moved, pacing the small space between the couch and the television like a caged animal. It's just, I kissed you. I kissed my best friend. I kissed a man. And it didn't feel like a mistake. That's the problem. It felt more real than anything has felt in years, and that terrifies me. What does that mean? Who am I? I've spent my entire life being one person, and now I don't know who that person is anymore. I look in the mirror and I don't recognize myself. He finally stopped pacing and stood in front of me, his defenses crumbling, the raw, terrified truth of his confession laid bare. He looked utterly lost. "I'm sorry, Julian," he whispered, his eyes pleading with me to understand. "I'm so sorry I ran. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say to you. Because saying it felt real was scarier than saying it was a mistake." And just like that, the anger in me dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of himself, of the new, uncharted territory he had stumbled into. He was grieving not just the end of his relationship with Clara, but the end of his understanding of himself. And I, in my own hurt, had failed to see that. I had made his crisis about my heart. I took a step towards him, closing the distance between us. "Hey," I said softly. "Look at me." He raised his head, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," I said. "You don't have to label it. You don't have to know who you are tomorrow. All you have to do is not run away. Talk to me. Be honest with me. We can figure the rest out together. But you can't shut me out. That's the only thing I can't handle." A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." It was not a resolution. It was not a declaration of love. But it was a start. It was an agreement to stop running, to face the terrifying, beautiful confusion together. He took a shaky breath and then, with a hesitation that spoke volumes, he reached out and took my hand. His fingers laced with mine, a fragile, tentative connection in the wreckage of his apartment. It was an anchor. It was a promise. It was enough. The days that followed that confrontation were quiet and careful. We were navigating a new world without a map, learning a new language one hesitant word at a time. The frantic, desperate energy was gone, replaced by a deliberate, thoughtful tenderness. We started over. He came to my apartment, but this time he knocked and waited for me to open the door, and we would talk for hours, really talk, in a way we hadn't in years. He talked about Clara, about the slow, painful erosion of their relationship, the things he had ignored, the ways he had been unhappy without even realizing it. And he talked about his fear, his confusion about what his feelings for me meant. I listened. I didn't offer easy answers, because there were none. I just provided the space for him to be honest, to be messy and uncertain. And I, in turn, was honest with him. I told him about the 15 years of silence. I told him about the moment in his dorm room when I realized I was in love with him. I told him about the fortress I had built and how he, in his grief, had wandered inside its gates without even knowing they were there. I confessed my own fear, my terror that I was just a temporary solace. It was the hardest, most terrifying conversation of my life, laying my heart bare after so many years of guarding it. He listened, his expression a mixture of awe and a deep, profound sadness for all the years we had lost to my silence. When I was finished, my voice raw with unshed emotion, he just reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "I'm so sorry, Jules," he said, his voice thick. "I'm sorry you carried that alone for so long." There was no pity in his voice, only a deep, abiding respect. And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. The foundation of our friendship, built on years of trust and loyalty, was strong enough to bear the weight of this new, fragile structure we were building on top of it. The couch ritual returned, but it was different now. It was intentional. There was no plausible deniability, no unspoken ambiguity. When he leaned his head on my shoulder, it was a clear and deliberate act of affection. When he took my hand, it was a statement. The first time he kissed me again, it was in the full light of the afternoon. We were sitting on the couch, talking, and he just paused mid-sentence, looked at me with a small, soft smile, and leaned in. It was a simple, confident kiss, a kiss that said, "This is real. This is us." And I kissed him back with all the pent-up love of a decade and a half, a kiss that said, "I know." Finally, our lives began to merge in a way that was both completely new and deeply familiar. He started leaving things at my apartment: a toothbrush, a change of clothes, his favorite coffee mug. His chaotic, grieving energy was replaced by a calm, settled presence. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, began to feel like our home. We found a new rhythm, a domestic intimacy that was quiet and profound. We would cook dinner together, bumping into each other in my small kitchen, our movements a clumsy but happy dance. We would fall asleep on the couch, not out of exhaustion, but because it was where we felt most comfortable, our bodies tangled together in a configuration of trust and love. Waking up to find him there, his face peaceful in the morning light, was a quiet miracle I never took for granted. He started to heal. The deep sadness in his eyes began to recede, replaced by the old sparkle I had missed so much. He started swimming again, coming home with his hair damp and the clean scent of chlorine clinging to him, his body tired but his mind clear. And I started taking photographs of him again, but this time, he was a willing and active participant. He would pose for me, laugh for me, and look directly into my lens with an open, loving gaze that took my breath away. These were not the secret love letters of the past. They were a shared story we were creating together, a visual record of our new beginning. One Saturday morning, several months into this new life, I woke up before him. He was asleep beside me, in my bed, a space that had once felt impossibly intimate and was now simply our space. The sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As I stood there, listening to the familiar gurgle of the machine, I looked around my apartment. His jacket was on the back of a chair. His running shoes were by the door. A book he was reading was face down on the coffee table. These small signs of his presence were no longer intrusions or temporary markers. They were part of the landscape. They were home. He wandered into the kitchen a few minutes later, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. He mumbled a sleepy morning into my neck. I leaned back against him, the warmth of his body a solid, reassuring presence, and covered his hands with my own. "You know," I said quietly, watching the steam rise from the coffee pot. "I think this is it." "Think what is it?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "This," I said, squeezing his hands. "You and me. This is the real thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he tightened his arms around me. "I know," he said, his voice clear and certain. "I think I knew it the first time I fell asleep on your couch and felt safer than I had in my entire life. It just took my head a little while to catch up with my heart. Love, I've come to understand, is not always a bolt of lightning or a sudden, dramatic revelation. Sometimes it is a slow and patient process of construction. It is the laying of a foundation, brick by brick, over years of shared laughter and quiet support. It is the slow erosion of walls you didn't even know you had built. It is the discovery that the person you have been standing next to all along is not just a pillar of support, but is, in fact, your home. We had to break to be rebuilt. He had to lose the life he thought he wanted to find the one that was waiting for him. And I had to risk the most important friendship I had ever known to finally be honest about the love that had defined it all along. The journey was fraught with fear and uncertainty, but as we stood there in the quiet morning light of our shared kitchen, the scent of coffee filling the air, I knew that every single moment of the long, 15-year wait had been worth it. We had found our way out of the fog, and we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together.